April 30th, 1943. A beach near Huelva, Spain. A local fisherman discovered a body floating in the surf. The corpse of a British Royal Marines officer, a briefcase chained securely to his wrist. Spanish authorities recovered the body and, just as British intelligence had hoped, allowed German agents to secretly access the contents of the briefcase. Inside, they found what appeared to be a gold mine, personal letters, and, most crucially, official documents detailing plans for a major Allied invasion of Greece and Sardinia. The intelligence was rushed to Berlin. It was the perfect deception. The body was a fake. It was a homeless man who had died in London. The documents were forgeries. The entire affair, code-named Operation Mincemeat, was an elaborate ruse designed to draw German attention away from the real target, Sicily. The year 1943 was the turning point of the war, a year when the Allies, having closed the ring around Fortress Europe, began to strike back. But seizing the initiative was one thing. Using it to break the back of the Wehrmacht would be another. In the rugged mountains of Sicily, in the flak-filled skies over Germany, and on the vast blood-soaked steppes of Russia, 1943 would exact a horrific price for victory. After the decisive defeat of the Italo-German forces in Tunisia, the combined chiefs of staff confirmed Sicily as the next stepping stone towards the invasion of Italy. They hoped that taking the island would provide freedom of movement for Allied forces across the Mediterranean and allow their bomber fleets to reach further into occupied Europe. It might also appease Stalin by opening up an additional front in Europe, just as the German forces were launching their own massive summer offensive at Kursk. The invasion of Sicily could even force Italy to withdraw from the war, although this was more of a hope than an expectation. Allied intelligence, through Operation Mincemeat and other deceptions, had successfully cast doubt among the Axis as to where the invasion would take place. British Field Marshal Harold Alexander would oversee the invasion, named Operation Husky, using the specifically created 15th Army Group, which included the British 8th and U.S. 7th Armies. The initial invasion force consisted of around 160,000 men, 600 tanks, and 1,800 guns. They would be supported by around 4,000 Allied aircraft of the Mediterranean Air Command, operating from North Africa and Malta. Their goal was to seize air superiority, interdict the island, and provide close air support. This force would face off against General Alfredo Guzzoni's 6th Italian Army. He had 10 divisions, although 6 of these were mostly static coastal defense formations. Overall, he had around 200,000 combat troops and 260 tanks and armored cars. They were supported by up to 30,000 German troops and personnel of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the Panzer Division Hermann Göring. Considered elite, these German divisions were nonetheless under-equipped and filled out with replacement soldiers after costly battles on the Eastern Front. But they could still field around 100 Panzer IIIs and IVs and 17 of the new Tiger tanks. In the air, the Axis had up to 1,600 available aircraft from multiple bases on Sicily, Sardinia, and mainland Italy. But the Italians struggled with poor equipment. The Livorno and Napoli divisions were arguably the best in the Italian army, but were largely equipped with obsolete early war tanks or captured French vehicles. The available Axis vehicles were grouped into mobile units, the most powerful of which was Battle Group Schmalz. Its job would be to counter any invading forces near Syracuse, Augusta, and Catania. Officially, the German troops were under Italian command, but in practice, the German commanders operated with a large degree of independence. Both of the Allied ground commanders, Bernard Montgomery and George Patton, had been highly critical of the invasion plan during its conception. They requested to use their veteran troops from North Africa, but Alexander encouraged them to use fresh troops so that these could gain experience. Enemy air power was also a major concern for the landing force, so the Air Chief Marshal, Arthur Tedder, suggested capturing and using the well-built enemy airfields in the southeast of Sicily. This would allow fighter units to take off directly from Sicily instead of Malta. Patton and Montgomery also requested more close air support during the landing, but Tedder argued that gaining air superiority by bombing enemy airfields was a better use of Allied air power. From early June, the Allied planners prepared for the invasion. On June 11th, the Allied Navy and Air Force bombarded the nearby fortress islands of Pantelleria and Lampedusa into submission. Then, on July 2nd, D-Day-7, Sicily and targets in southern Italy came under heavy aerial and naval bombardment to disrupt and destroy supply lines, airfields, and defenses. As a result, the Axis relocated the vast majority of their aircraft to mainland Italy, leaving only 125 in Sicily. By this time, the Mediterranean Air Command had achieved air superiority over the region, although the Luftflotte II still had bomber and fighter reserves available to potentially disrupt the landing. Meanwhile, British and American paratroopers were getting ready for their drops. The airborne component of Husky had been developed at short notice, and some commanders were concerned about the drop planned for the night of July 9th. The U.S. 82nd Airborne Commander, Major General Matthew Ridgway, was worried about friendly fire and a lack of night flying experience among the American pilots. In all, 5,300 airborne troops were supposed to land in Sicily. The U.S. troops would mostly jump from C-47s, while the British paratroopers would arrive on gliders. But there was a lack of trained glider pilots, and the U.S. C-47 pilots had little experience in towing gliders. Once on the ground, the paratroopers were to secure important crossroads and bridges to slow or stop Axis counterattacks against the landing beaches. The 82nd Airborne was tasked with seizing the high ground around the junction at Piano Lupo, while the British 1st Air Landing Brigade was to capture the important Ponte Grande Bridge near Syracuse. As the first Allied planes headed for Sicily, things quickly went wrong. The planes towing the gliders rapidly fell out of formation and lost their bearings. Things got even worse when they came under anti-aircraft fire. The tug pilots dipped and weaved, and some prematurely released their gliders. Of the 144 gliders dispatched, only 54 landed in Sicily, and only 6 on their intended target. Up to 69 may have crashed into the sea, likely drowning around 300 paratroopers. This meant only around 100 men were immediately available to attack their targets. The American drop fared little better. The pilots again lost their way in the dark, while strong winds battered the landing zones. Most of the paratroopers landed in small, scattered groups, and less than 200 were immediately available to capture the Piano Lupo junction. In many cases, troopers simply landed and made their way towards the noise of battle. But despite the low numbers, the Anglo-American troops attacked many of their first objectives. A single glider team captured the Ponte Grande Bridge, and U.S. paratroopers battled against the defenders at Piano Lupo. U.S. paratrooper Bob Fielder recalled approaching the nearby Piazza Ridge. Quote, "Suddenly there was an unmistakable loud ripping burst from a rapid-fire German machine gun. Never having heard the sound of 1,200 rounds per minute, I wondered what in the world is that?" Unquote.
At Ponte Grande, Italian troops with mortars and armored cars attacked the British paratroopers, whittling their numbers down to just 70. The paratroopers now awaited relief by the seaborne forces. Despite the high casualties, the missed drops did have one unintended benefit. The widely dispersed landings made the invasion seem larger than it was, and the Axis forces were occupied dealing with these widespread guerrilla-style attacks. Although General Guzzoni announced an invasion, the Axis command made no serious effort to counter it on the beaches. Coinciding with the nighttime airdrops were coastal commando raids by No. 3 Commando and SAS teams. Their job was to clear coastal guns and obstacles. At around 3 a.m. on July 10th, the first seaborne units landed. At the Pacino Peninsula, the Royal Marines, 1st Canadian, and 51st Highland Divisions came ashore in the darkness to find most of the Italian positions abandoned. In many cases, the coastal defenders had simply fled their posts. The British 50th and 5th Divisions landed south of Syracuse to equally light resistance. By 5 a.m., the British and Canadians had secured their beaches, and heavier landing craft were delivering tanks and trucks. Allied troops took the Pacino airfield, which they then readied for Allied aircraft. The British 50th Division ran into the British paratroopers who had just retreated from Ponte Grande, and together they rapidly retook the bridge. The American landings also largely went to plan, despite the rough seas. Major General Lucien Truscott's 3rd Division landed first and swept towards Licata to cover the landing beach's left flank. As they advanced, they knocked out coastal defenses and railway guns to clear the way for the other divisions. In the east, the 45th Division captured the Comiso airfield and secured the landing beach's right flank. The 1st Infantry Division landed at Gela, including a contingent of French-Moroccan troops, and although the resistance was stiffer, they took the town by 8 a.m. By now, the first serious Axis counterattacks arrived, as General Guzzoni ordered the Livorno and Hermann Göring divisions against the U.S. beaches. However, the bombing and paratrooper activity had cut communications, meaning these first counterattacks were poorly coordinated. To the east, Italian black-shirt militia attacked the Canadians, who easily pushed them back. The British troops now approached Syracuse, a major port and key to the continuous naval supply for the British landing forces. Guzzoni had hoped its formidable defenses would protect it. However, Allied troops entered in the afternoon to a reportedly riotous welcome from the locals. Italian units did counterattack towards the city, including with captured French R-35 tanks, but by now the British troops had brought up their anti-tank guns and other defenses. Italian tank commander Adamo Profico recalled the attack. Quote, "We left, my tank in the lead. After a few hundred meters, my driver turned to me and shouted, 'Mines!' The tracks of our tank had already gone over the first mines, which duly went off. The second tank arrived at full speed, and as it took the curve, a gun hit its right tracks. This disabled its steering, and it careened off, rolling down the escarpment. Right on its heels, the third tank arrived, also going at full speed. As soon as it had made the curve, its front was hit." Unquote. By the end of D-Day, the Allied commanders likely felt that things were going well. Their troops were ashore, the beachheads were expanding, several captured airfields were already in use by Allied fighters, and the key port of Syracuse had fallen. But there were mounting issues. Of the 5,300 airborne troops dispatched, only 2,000 were fit for duty the next day. Army commanders on the ground also complained about a lack of air cover. With Allied aircraft occupied with fighter and fleet escort missions, no close air support was available on D-Day and D+1. This lack of continuous air cover allowed a German Luftwaffe attack on the Gela transport area to get through and sink the ammunition ship SS Robert Rowan.
The Axis forces were also recovering from the initial shock. Now that they had identified the landing beaches and the Allied forces, Guzzoni ordered more organized counterattacks. Battle Group Schmalz blocked the Allied progress towards Augusta, while the Livorno and Hermann Göring divisions made a stronger move against the Gela beachhead. On July 11th, 3 Italo-German columns attempted to break through to Gela. In the west and center, the Americans repelled the Livorno division with heavy losses. However, the Hermann Göring division's Panzers made better progress against the light anti-tank weapons of the U.S. screening forces. The German tanks broke open the line and headed for Gela and the beaches. With Allied tactical support aircraft busy elsewhere, the 1st Division rushed anti-tank guns and armor ashore. Eventually, a handful of vulnerable catapult-launched Navy spotter planes were able to direct the devastating naval gunfire and stop the German attack. Axis commanders realized the offshore armada would destroy any further attempts to reach the shore, so their forces withdrew and took up blocking positions around Caltagirone. But despite the failure of the Italo-German counterattack, they did slow the progress of the American 1st and 45th Divisions. The Luftwaffe was less successful and was only able to offer sporadic resistance from the remaining Sicilian airfields. Johannes Steinhoff from Jagdgeschwader 77 later recounted the desperation in his memoirs. With what we could scrape together of the remnants of the group, we would fly along the north coast over Etna's crater towards the Straits of Messina, where we would fling ourselves at the B-17 flying fortresses in a series of uncoordinated attacks. Our numbers were so few that we would do little damage, and even that little depended upon our breaking through to the bombers. To reinforce the U.S. troops, further paratrooper drops were planned for late on July 11th, but the drop was another disaster. Recent German bomber attacks had the Allied anti-aircraft units on high alert. When the Navy and Army gunners spotted the friendly C-47s, they mistook them for Axis craft and opened fire on them. 23 of the 144 transport planes were lost to friendly fire, with an estimated 90 aircrew and 229 paratrooper casualties. A report by the 82nd Airborne Division blamed a lack of communication and preparation among the ground forces. Meanwhile, the fleet commander, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, blamed the pilots for flying outside of the agreed-upon air corridors. As the U.S. advance bogged down, the British 8th Army made better progress along the coast. The British took Augusta on July 12th, but resistance from dug-in enemy units was stiffening. Montgomery now developed a plan to open new routes of advance for his British troops. While continuing to push towards Catania along the coast, he ordered the 30 Corps to swing around Mount Etna from the west, with the aim of cutting the island in two. However, this required the British troops to take over the U.S. objectives around Caltagirone and give them exclusive use of Highway 124. Patton was outraged that his force was now being relegated to supporting the British maneuver. So in response, Alexander allowed the U.S. 3rd Division to advance towards Agrigento. As Montgomery took increasing control of the offensive, the German commanders were also taking control of the defense. General der Panzertruppe Hans Valentin Hube of the 14th Corps took over de facto command of the island, while the incoming German formations were preparing to reinforce him. The elite 1st Fallschirmjäger Division was on the way, as was the freshly reformed 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. On July 13th, Montgomery opened his major push towards Catania. First, nighttime airborne and seaborne commando raids were to capture two bridges, the Ponte dei Malati and the Ponte del Primosole. The 50th Division would then break through the Axis defenses around 30 kilometers to the south, link up with the commandos, and strike for Catania. Once again, the airdrops went poorly. Both friendly and enemy anti-aircraft fire forced nearly 30% of the gliders to return to base, and only 200 men and 3 anti-tank guns dropped near to their target. To make matters worse, they had dropped directly on top of the newly arrived 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. The British did capture the Primosole Bridge, but came under immediate German attack.
The British used captured anti-tank guns and mines to repel the assaults, but casualties were mounting and their ammunition was running out. Eventually, they decided to relocate to a hill to the south of the bridge and cover it from there until the 50th Division arrived. However, the 50th Division had expected to fight against Italian units, not hardened German paratroopers, and their progress was slow. The fighting was particularly tough in the dense vineyards and orange groves. A soldier of the 5th East Yorkshire Regiment recalled, "I couldn't see more than 20 yards in the orange groves. Some unidentified troops were moving alongside a small wall. As we were debating who they might be, the question was solved by the rapid burr of a Spando not very far away."
On July 14th, the 50th Division reached the bridge but found the northern bank under solid German control. The British troops waded across on July 15th, but German machine guns and artillery soon pinned them down. Only a small Allied bridgehead was formed. On July 17th, after tough fighting around the bridgehead, the British made another attempt towards Catania under a heavy creeping barrage. Sergeant Georg Schmitz of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division was on the receiving end. "We survived the 1.5-hour barrage well under the cover of the tank trench. We had orders not to open fire until Oberstleutnant Walter gave the order. Thus, without a shot being fired from our side, the attacking enemy came unhindered into the range of fire of our infantry weapons. But then he was met by our furious defensive fire. The attacker had very heavy losses, and the attack was beaten off." The British attacked again on July 18th, but they were unable to break through to Catania or the nearby airdrome. The next day, Montgomery abandoned the plan and shifted the focus to his planned swing around Mount Etna. But what was envisioned as a speedy thrust was also an arduous slog. On July 17th, the Canadians pushed along Highway 124 but were stopped short of Enna by tenacious resistance. The Axis forces had already shifted their positions to counter the move. General Hubie decided to abandon the west of Sicily and fall back to a series of defensive lines around Etna. His plan was now to defend Sicily as long as possible before withdrawing his forces across the Messina Straits into Italy. However, this withdrawal was not a retreat. German and Italian rearguard units continued to contest town after town. Demolitions and booby traps further slowed the Allied advance. With Montgomery bogged down, Patton sensed an opportunity. He demanded that the U.S. forces be given a more significant objective, arguing that there was a political necessity for the American public to see their troops at work. Alexander conceded and allowed Patton to capture Palermo, a major port and the largest city on the island. The U.S. forces, especially the 2nd Armored Division, now raced forward against isolated pockets of mostly Italian troops, who often surrendered after only token resistance. Colonel James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne recalled, "It was unlike anything else I had encountered during the war. Suddenly a machine gun or anti-tank weapon would open up, and then the white flags would appear. A shot had been fired for honor, but it was just as likely to cause casualties as a shot fired in anger." The U.S. troops had another advantage in their drive across Sicily. A large number of the American troops were Italian Americans, some with Sicilian heritage. They occasionally received a warm reception from the locals and could use their connections to gain important intelligence. The U.S. intelligence also made use of criminal connections among the New York mafia families with ties to Sicily. The local Sicilian mafia, opposed to Mussolini, helped to gather intelligence and guide the Allied troops through the mountain passes. Meanwhile, the German troops reported a hostile attitude towards their continued presence.
German paratrooper Josef Klein recalled the response to his unit's demolition work. In Trescastagni, some civilians emerged as spokesmen, waving old hunting rifles around and assuming a threatening posture. The kerfuffle did not end until our platoon sergeant had a machine gun group with an MG-42 set up on the market square. On at least one occasion, these tensions spilled over into murder. The Hermann Göring Division shot 16 Italian men in Castiglione di Sicilia, likely as retaliation for supposed thefts. By July 22nd, the Americans had taken Palermo, and the Allies had practically cut the island in two at Termini Imerese. The U.S. troops took 50,000 Italian prisoners with only 272 casualties. Patton now directed his troops along the northern coast of Sicily to participate in the attack towards Messina. Indeed, for him, it had now become a race about whether the American or the British would get there first. Meanwhile, in Rome, the war took an unexpected and dramatic turn. The Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, was voted out of the fascist Grand Council and arrested. His time as Il Duce was now over. King Victor Emmanuel assumed full constitutional powers. Mussolini had faced a growing conspiracy from within his own general staff, and the Sicilian invasion, paired with the Allied bombing of mainland Italy, had acted as a final nail in his coffin. But with Hitler watching closely, Italy vowed to continue the war for the time being. Mussolini's removal also ended any pretense of Italian command in Sicily. General Hube now oversaw the entire withdrawal and evacuation. His troops continued to fight rearguard actions towards the Etna line, based around the formidable Centuripe position. Meanwhile, the U.S. troops advanced towards Troina, another prepared defensive point. Carefully positioned German anti-tank guns, machine guns, and tanks took their toll. In many cases, small groups of Axis troops delayed entire Allied divisions in the narrow mountain roads. Progress was also hampered by a lack of close air support coordination by the Allies. The process of requesting airstrikes was slow and convoluted, and in any case, the fragile radio equipment broke down or could not get through the mountainous terrain. Confused boundaries between the U.S. and British units added to the problem. As the British 30th Corps assaulted Centuripe, fighter bombers of the U.S. 12th Air Support Command attacked them by mistake. The 30th Corps commander, General Oliver Leese, phoned General Omar Bradley to complain. "What have we done that your chaps would want to bomb us? They've hit right on top of my headquarters. They have really plastered the town." The exhausted and inexperienced Allied units were now near their breaking point. Major Derek de Stackpole of the 7th Royal Marines, an entirely green formation, recalled an attack on Ditiano. "My God, when I think of the things that went wrong, the unpreparedness and the rush and hurry of the whole blasted amateurish mess-up. Poor old 7th RN, never have so many been buggered about by so few." Only the release of experienced units from North Africa broke the deadlock. Aided by the arrival of the British 78th Battle Axe Division, the British and Canadians captured Centuripe and its dominating heights on August 1st.
On August 6th, the U.S. 1st Division finally captured Troina, but only after the Axis had counterattacked no less than 24 times. With these two positions lost, General Hube knew the battle was now over. He sped up his preparations for the evacuation, but continued his punishing rearguard actions. The British 3rd Division, advancing along the coast, was especially held up at Montefertello. To assist it, Patton ordered amphibious landings behind the enemy lines on August 8th, 11th, and 16th. Although risky, these so-called end runs did ease the advance. The British also conducted their own landing on August 16th to cut off the retreating elements of the Hermann Göring Division, but were unable to catch them. Both Allied forces now converged in Messina, and during the night of August 16th, the vanguard of the U.S. 3rd Division entered the outskirts of the city. Hubei's well-organized evacuation came to an end. The narrow straits, the coastal guns, and the large anti-aircraft forces meant that the Allied forces mostly did not disrupt the evacuation, and on August 17th, Hubei's command was one of the last units to leave Sicily. Of the eventual 460,000 Allied troops in Sicily, around 5,000 were killed and up to 16,000 were wounded in Operation Husky. An additional 3,500 were missing. Of those killed, 1,400 were paratroopers. The German losses were 4,500 killed, 13,500 wounded, and around 10,000 missing or captured. The Italian losses were especially high. 4,650 Italian troops were killed, 5,000 were wounded, and up to 152,000 were missing or captured. The loss of Sicily also decimated the Axis air units. In July 1943 alone, 711 German aircraft were lost in the Mediterranean theater, and the Italian Regia Aeronautica was in the process of dissolution after Husky, a high cost for the limited damage they were able to inflict. But despite these results, there were Allied complaints with this first major joint operation. There was poor coordination, especially between the different branches, as well as animosity and a lack of communication between the commanders. Although the tactical air superiority improved as the invasion went on, the army commanders consistently claimed that they rarely saw friendly air cover. The air commanders replied that they were attacking targets further to the rear, a more important contribution. Better communication regarding objectives and methods may have smoothed over these tensions. General Alexander was also accused of giving Montgomery too much control and undervaluing the U.S. troops' potential, while Patton too was criticized by both his superiors and his subordinates. General Omar Bradley, who served under Patton, accused him of recklessness with the lives of his men, especially in his race to beat Montgomery to Messina, a race some historians suggest Montgomery was not even aware of. News also emerged of two incidents in which Patton slapped enlisted men, and at Biscari on July 14th, U.S. troops massacred 73 Axis prisoners. The perpetrators claimed that Patton had ordered for no prisoners to be taken, something Patton denied. There were also missed Allied opportunities, as General Hubei's phased withdrawal had preserved his fighting strength. In the first 17 days of August, the Axis evacuated 100,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, 200 artillery guns, and 47 tanks to Italy, where they would continue the struggle. However, the Allies also learned lessons from their mistakes. For example, almost all of their aircraft would display clear invasion stripes to prevent friendly fire during the Normandy invasions, while their airborne operations would enjoy longer planning periods and the wider use of Pathfinder units to guide in the paratroopers. They also made tactical improvements, including improved rugged radios and clearer channels for requesting air support. Arguably, the biggest outcome of Operation Husky was also a mostly unintended one. The removal of Mussolini opened the question of Italy's role in the war. But while the Allied demand for unconditional surrender remained, Italy seemed reluctant to surrender, and the battle for Italy would continue. In fact, many of the units, on both sides, who had fought in Sicily would soon meet again on new battlefields. The next step for the Allies was the invasion of the Italian peninsula, which began on September 3rd, an event that caused the collapse of Mussolini's former regime and a new Italian government to join the Allies. It was a political success for the Allies, but militarily, things quickly bogged down into grinding positional warfare. The American, British, and Canadian forces were able to gain a foothold, but the Germans quickly disarmed the Italian army, took control of the country, and rushed their troops to the landing zones. The Allied troubles in command and coordination, plus Italy's mountainous terrain and a skillful German defense, all meant that by the end of the year, the larger Allied forces were stuck up against the German position south of Rome known as the Gustav Line, with its formidable strongpoint at Monte Cassino. In fact, the truly decisive breakthrough was going on at the same time as Operation Husky, but far to the east. There, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army were waging the biggest battle of all time at Kursk, and although the Germans would inflict more losses than they suffered, the Red Army would emerge victorious. In the spring of 1943, Nazi Germany's leaders were facing a strategic dilemma. The Soviets had stopped their 1942 offensive at Stalingrad. Allied bombers were pounding German cities. The Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered to the British and Americans, and the Allied ships were winning the war against the U-boats. But Adolf Hitler and his generals knew they could not defeat the Soviet Union while fighting a multi-front war, so he was cautious. This year we cannot undertake any large operation in the east. We must avoid all risks. I think we can only make limited strikes. Hitler believed that once the Anglo-Americans tried and failed to open a second front in France, he would be able to strike a decisive blow against the USSR. His immediate priority was to draw the Red Army into a battle of attrition to weaken it so badly that the Soviets would not be able to launch a major offensive of their own in 1943. This was especially important since in the spring of 1943, the Red Army outnumbered the Wehrmacht in the east 2.1 to 1 in men, 4.6 to 1 in tanks, and 3.1 to 1 in guns. And despite the catastrophic losses in men and equipment suffered by the Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942, the Red Army commanders were indeed planning sweeping offensives. They planned to smash the Germans around Oriol, which would open the way to Bryansk, Minsk, Poland, and East Prussia, while the simultaneous offensive through Kharkiv would let them recapture Poltava and Kiev and threaten the German rear to the north or its allies Hungary and Romania. If the Soviet plan worked, the war might be over by 1944. So the Germans had a conservative plan for the Eastern Front in the summer of 1943, while the Soviets had high hopes for major breakthroughs, and both sides were focusing around the town of Kursk.
The Soviet General Staff, or Stavka, expected the Germans to attack the Red Army in the exposed Kursk salient, so they deployed two army groups in the area, the Central Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky and the Voronezh Front under Nikolai Vatutin. They also created a reserve army group for a counterattack, the Steppe Military District under Ivan Konev. The Red Army engineers also turned the salient into a fortress to bleed out the attacking Germans. But some of the Soviet leaders began to doubt the defensive plan, given the long delays in building the fortifications. Joseph Stalin and Vatutin both argued that the Red Army should hit the Germans first to spoil the expected enemy attack. Eventually, Marshals Vasilevsky and Zhukov convinced Stalin to start on the defensive to weaken the German armored formations before going over to the counterattack, especially because of the new German heavy Tiger tanks. The Red Army had captured a Tiger in January 1943, and the test results showed that its armor was extremely strong. The regular soldiers were worried about the Tiger too. But the Germans have gotten ahead of us with their tanks again. The worst is that our guns and tanks aren't equal to the Tiger. Learning how to fight against the Tigers was a key part of the Soviet preparations. The Red Army anti-tank crews learned to target their vision ports or the commander's hatches, which had a tendency to shear off after a hit. The Soviets built 6 defensive belts to protect the salient and prevent a German breakthrough. Together, the belts included 9,200 kilometers of trenches, sometimes 4 lines deep, along with 1 million mines. Most of the 300,000 civilian workers who worked on the fortifications were women. The 2 first belts were the strongest to allow for the destruction of the German tanks, and it was here that the Soviets created their anti-tank strongpoints. A typical strongpoint had a company of anti-tank riflemen, a squad of engineers with explosives, 4 to 10 anti-tank guns, and 2 or 3 tanks or self-propelled guns. The Soviet troops also dug in their vehicles so that only the turrets were visible to the enemy. But the German aircraft detected the Soviet strongpoints, and so the Wehrmacht command issued instructions on how to engage them. The numerous anti-tank strongpoints visible in aerial photographs must be engaged as follows. A. Stuka attack immediately followed by grenadiers attacking with fire support from Tigers. B. Strongpoints are to be suppressed by artillery fire and Tiger gun fire, then the infantry attack, followed by a supporting attack by tanks. Aside from the fortifications, the backbone of the Soviet defense was their artillery, and they had lots of it, up to 70 guns per kilometer of front in some sectors. The Soviet partisans behind the German lines also contributed to the defense, and in June alone they launched 1,100 attacks against German logistics and infrastructure, damaging 400 locomotives and 54 railway bridges. The Soviets were also planning for the counteroffensives they would launch if they could stop the German attacks. In Operation Kutuzov, the West, Bronsk, and Central fronts would attack the German-controlled Oriol salient and continue west. Meanwhile, the Voronezh, Steppe, and Southwest fronts would strike towards Kharkiv in Operation Commander Rumyanantsev. So the Red Army was preparing for a German attack around Kursk and preparing a massive counteroffensive. And it was these preparations that helped to make up Hitler's mind about where to strike. Hitler had originally wanted to attack in the Donbass region to secure control of its critical natural resources. It was his generals who convinced the Führer to attack at Kursk to cripple the Soviet offensive potential. And he was not the author of the attack plan, unlike what the German generals would later say after the war. But the attack was delayed, and Hitler and his generals debated what to do. In April, the 9th Army commander, General Walter Model, told Hitler that he thought he could win at Kursk, but his army was not strong enough yet, so Hitler decided to wait until reinforcements arrived. Then in May, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, and Hitler feared that Italy might soon leave the alliance, or that the Allies might land in Italy or Greece. He decided to wait until the situation in the Mediterranean was clear before committing in the east. But in the second half of May, heavy rains turned the roads in the Soviet Union to mud and rendered any attack impossible. In June, everything was ready, but Hitler was still hesitant. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Kurt Zeitzler had been telling him that the Red Army around Kursk was getting stronger, and the longer the Germans waited, the worse their chances would be. So Hitler decided he would wait for the Soviets to attack first, instead. Then, in late June, the Army Group Center Commander Günther von Kluge convinced Hitler that he must attack as soon as possible.
The offensive, Operation Citadel, was set to begin on July 5, 1943. The German plan was to encircle the Soviets and crush them. Model's 9th Army was to break through the strongest Soviet positions in just 2 days and complete the northern half of the encirclement. The southern pincer consisted of General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf. Hoth's tanks would lead the assault until they met up with the 9th Army and trapped the Red Army's best forces in a pocket. Including their reserves, the Germans had about 900,000 men, 3,900 tanks and self-propelled guns, 1,800 planes, and 8,300 artillery pieces and mortars. These figures, though, include the Second Army that would not participate in the attack. But the German plan had a fatal flaw. They had badly underestimated the Soviet strength. Including their reserves, the Red Army had 2.6 million men, 8,900 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,900 planes, and 47,400 artillery pieces and mortars that it could throw into the battle. They had also introduced new heavy weapons systems like the Su-122 and Su-152 self-propelled guns. So the Germans had finally decided to attack at Kursk, just what the Soviets had been preparing for. But when the battle started, the Red Army was in for a surprise. In the night of July 4th-5th, several German soldiers crossed the lines to surrender and told the Soviets the attack was imminent. The Soviet aircraft and artillery sprang into action to catch the Germans in their jumping-off positions. General Rokossovsky later recorded his assessment.
Our artillery fire plastered the enemy troops preparing to attack, caused heavy losses, especially in artillery, and disrupted command systems. Our strike surprised the fascists and made them think that we were about to attack. It took 2 hours before the enemy artillery started preparatory fire, which was disorganized and weak. For decades, this was the picture accepted by both Soviet and Western historians, but it is not true. In reality, the Soviet artillery strikes came too soon and did little damage, and the German fighters shot down 300 Soviet planes on the first day alone. When the ground attack began on July 5th, the Germans broke through the first defensive belt in the north and the south. The next day, they pierced the second belt, shocking the Soviet commanders who had expected their months of preparation would provide better results. The Central and Voronezh fronts both rushed in their reserves, but a major counterattack in the north failed to drive the Germans back. Rokossovsky now ordered that the Soviet tanks should not be sent against the German armor, as he wrote later. Given the superiority of the enemy, especially in heavy tanks, our tanks should only counterattack against infantry or light vehicles. This order was necessary given the situation. There were cases when our tankers rushed to attack Tigers, only to be pushed back behind the infantry with heavy losses. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army had more success and penetrated the 3rd Soviet defensive belt on July 11th. Manstein admitted on July 13th that his forces were too weak to surround the Soviets on their own, but he also wanted the offensive to continue. Hitler wanted to avoid any further discussion with the headstrong general, so he told Manstein that his Army Group South would have to give up some of its forces to help to counter the Allied landings in Sicily. But this was just an excuse, and Hitler did not send any units from the Eastern Front to Sicily for the next 10 days. But Hitler's ruse worked, and Manstein reluctantly accepted that Operation Citadel had failed. Still, Hitler's lie that he needed to send reinforcements to Sicily became one of the most persistent myths about the Battle of Kursk and still has many defenders today. The German offensive had failed thanks to lack of forces and stiff Soviet resistance, and because the Soviet counteroffensive had now begun. On July 12th, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov. The Soviets broke through the German positions facing Orel, forcing the 9th German Army to send reinforcements to help to plug the gaps, which sealed Citadel's fate beyond a doubt. Red Army soldier Evgeny Besonov later described how the Luftwaffe tried to slow the Soviet advance. That was my first experience of such a heavy air raid. It was pure hell. You're just lying in your foxhole and waiting for death. Bombs are exploding all around you. The ground is shaking and you are shaking. I was frightened to death and wanted to run away from that hell, but I was a platoon commander and had to stay with my soldiers. Further south, the Red Army attacked the 4th Panzer Army's vulnerable spearhead. The 5th Guard Tank Army, supported by the 5th Guard Army, would lead the charge after having sat in reserve so far. The Soviet Tank Army was to destroy the German armor near the village of Prokhorovka, break through the German line, and drive ahead 30 kilometers. The Soviets used radio transmissions and fake troop movements to confuse the Germans into thinking there were 2 more Soviet armies west of the German spearheads, but this was just a ruse. The attack was so critical to the Soviets that Stalin sent Marshal Vasilevsky himself to Prokhorovka. But when Vasilevsky realized the Germans had advanced much farther than expected, he panicked and ordered a rushed start to the operation on the morning of July 12th. But the Red Army was not yet ready, and when the 5th Guard Tank Army smashed into the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, confusion reigned. German intelligence had failed to anticipate the Soviet attack, so the SS soldiers, like Erhard Gurs, were completely surprised. We were all sleeping, then they were on top of us, with planes, endless tanks with infantry on them. It was hell. They were around us, above us, and in the midst of us. We fought, man for man. We jumped out of our foxholes, jumped on our vehicles, and took on all comers. It was hell.
Despite the shock,
The Germans recovered and inflicted a heavy defeat on the attacking 5th Guards Tank Army. The SS units not only held their positions, but also knocked out 382 Soviet tanks and assault guns, of which 227 were completely destroyed. The Soviets were only able to knock out a dozen German tanks, and only 4 of those were not recoverable. These figures are in stark contrast to the later Soviet portrayals of the battle as a Red Army success. For the Germans, Prokhorovka was limited to a local, tactical defensive success. The Soviets still had the upper hand, but had to delay their main counteroffensive for 3 weeks because of the heavy losses they had suffered so far. On August 3rd, they were finally ready to launch the final phase of the battle, Operation Commander Rumiantsov. 7 Soviet armies, 2 of them tank armies, stormed the German lines in the southern part of the Kursk salient. 3 more Soviet armies joined them in the next few days, a total of 1 million men and 2,440 tanks and self-propelled guns. Trying to stop them were the 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, both of which had been weakened by sending units to other parts of the front. They had only 210,000 men and 640 tanks and assault guns, of which just 270 were combat-ready. The Red Army immediately smashed the German line north of Kharkiv and advanced towards the southwest. The German units had to avoid being surrounded, so they beat a hasty retreat. On August 5th, the Soviet forces liberated Belgorod and Oryol. For the first time since the start of the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army had beaten the Wehrmacht in a big summer battle. In Moscow, the Red Army cannons fired a massive 124-gun salute at midnight to commemorate the double liberation. On the 7th, elements of General Katukov's 1st Tank Army reached Bogodukhov, just 50 kilometers from Kharkiv, and nearly behind the German forces fighting there. The German command rushed Panzer divisions from other parts of the front and managed to stop the Soviet tank spearhead. In the following days, both sides sent more and more reinforcements into the fighting, which developed into another major tank battle. The desperate Germans even weakened their forces defending Kharkiv, which Hitler wanted to hold at all costs to stop this dangerous Soviet drive. The Soviets were trying to push farther southwest towards Poltava, the most important communications and logistics hub for Germany's Army Group South. On August 11th, the Red Army launched another attack, this time with the fresh 1st Guards Army of the Southwest Front. The goal was to encircle Kharkiv from the south. Army Detachment Kempf was now surrounded on 3 sides, and the defense of Kharkiv was becoming untenable. The Germans were able to stop the Voronezh front west of Kharkiv, but the steppe and southwest fronts were getting closer and closer to the city. By the 18th, Hitler had to admit the situation in Kharkiv was hopeless for the Wehrmacht, and that prolonging the city's defense risked another Stalingrad-style disaster. He allowed Manstein to give up the city if necessary. The same day, the Germans completed their retreat from the Oryol sector, bringing Operation Kutuzov to a close. The Soviet pincers closed ever tighter around Kharkiv, and on the night of August 22nd to 23rd, the Wehrmacht left the city to the Red Army. The Battle of Kursk, which had raged for 50 days, was over. The Battle of Kursk was the biggest battle of the Second World War and one of the bloodiest in history. Historians still argue about the Soviet losses today, and the exact figures will probably never be known. In all probability, at least 1.2 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded, 7,000 tanks and assault guns were destroyed, and 3,000 aircraft were lost. The Germans lost about 203,000 dead, wounded, and missing, 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 650 aircraft. Although the Soviet losses were far heavier and the Red Army failed to achieve all of its operational goals, Kursk was a serious defeat for the Germans. They had hesitated before deciding to attack and to exploit their initial successes. They had underestimated the enemy,
and had had inaccurate intel, and all of this without any margin for error given their logistical and numerical disadvantages. They did not achieve any of the goals they had had when they attacked in July either. They did not destroy the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. They did not weaken the Red Army enough to prevent its offensive. They did not shorten the front to free up their reserves. And they did not capture the hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners they had wanted to put to work as forced laborers in Germany. Hitler had hoped that a victory at Kursk would convince the world that the Wehrmacht was invincible. But the result was the opposite. For the first time, the Red Army had stopped a German summer offensive within a few days and, despite enormous losses, had gone over to the offensive all along the Eastern Front. By the end of the summer of 1943, the German combat power in the East was exhausted, and they could no longer replace their losses. The defeat at Kursk also had repercussions at home. In the spring of 1943, most Germans still believed that a military victory over the USSR was possible. But after Kursk, morale began to fall. And the victory at Kursk was the start of more Axis setbacks in the East. From August to December, the Red Army threw the Germans back from Kharkiv to the Dnipro River. The Soviet forces recaptured Kyiv in November, but the German forces fought hard and managed to keep a few bridgeheads on the eastern bank. At the German headquarters, these minor successes and the stabilization of the line in December were optimistically interpreted as a sign that they might have weathered the storm. Meanwhile, another storm was brewing in the skies above the Reich as the British and American air forces launched their bombing campaign to strike at German industry and civilian morale. At the January 1943 Casablanca Conference, the Allied commanders called for a combined bomber offensive against Germany. The goal was to hit key industries and military targets in preparation for an invasion in 1944. The Allied command still prioritized the U-boat facilities at first, but by June 1943, the point-blank directive shifted the focus to German aircraft and ball-bearing production. The U.S. Army Air Force Chief, Henry Arnold, strongly supported strategic bombing and had expanded the U.S. air power since 1940. He especially believed that the targeted daytime bombing of specific key industries, like oil or ball bearings, could cripple German war production. The RAF Bomber Command Chief, Arthur Harris, who was skeptical of such bottleneck bombing, wanted the U.S. to join the RAF in nighttime area bombing. But Arnold maintained his independence. The 8th and RAF campaigns would build on each other, but were largely separate. From the U.S. side, the 8th Bomber Command would carry out most of the new mission for the summer and fall of 1943, flying from RAF air bases across East Anglia. By the late summer, the U.S. had almost 300 heavy B-17 bombers in 21 bombardment groups ready for operations in the skies over occupied Europe. The 8th had conducted small-scale raids, especially in occupied France in 1942, but a lack of bombers had limited its operations against Germany. By 1943, though, new aircraft, personnel, and equipment were arriving, allowing for operations to be ramped up. In the summer of 1943, the 8th launched a series of raids to coincide with the RAF's bombing of Hamburg. Starting on July 24, 1943, the U.S. bombers hit targets across Norway and Germany over 6 days in a mini-campaign known as Blitz Week, with mixed results. A firestorm in Hamburg damaged some U-boat production facilities and killed and wounded thousands of civilians, while the Norway bombing set back nitrate production by a few months. But the bomber losses mounted, and the available fighter escorts were inadequate. Overall, the USAAF lost about 100 B-17s across Blitz Week, with 90 casualties. Still, replacements were arriving from the U.S., and the commanders planned new, even more ambitious raids. Operation Double Strike targeted the Regensburg aircraft factories and the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plant in a coordinated raid, the deepest yet into Germany. Colonel Curtis LeMay's 4th Bombardment Wing would attack the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg before flying on to land in North Africa. The planners hoped that these so-called shuttle raids would confuse the enemy air controllers and wrong-foot the defending fighters. The 4th Wing's unexpected flight to Algeria would hopefully divert the Luftwaffe forces away from the 1st Bombardment Wing's outward and return flight to Schweinfurt. This was even more vital, as both raids would lack fighter escort for much of their route. Fuel limitations meant that many of the escorts would turn back near the Dutch border, while the long-range additional fuel tanks were scarce. However, the raid on August 17th quickly went wrong. Poor weather delayed the departure of the Schweinfurt force, meaning it took off 4 hours after the Regensburg force, instead of the planned 10 minutes. As the 146 Regensburg bombers passed into the Luftwaffe's operational areas, the German fighters scrambled and attacked along a 260-kilometer-long aerial battlefield. We came down on them from the front and slightly above. The huge airplanes were quickly distinguished as individual targets. We aimed at the fuselage and the right engines. We fired, then ripped through the entire bunch lightning quick. A fantastic moment. Some of the monsters had caught fire. I dodged their huge shark-like tails with their large black code letters. Over Regensburg, the fighters withdrew, and the bombing was generally effective. One of its biggest impacts was unintended, as it destroyed the secret experimental Me-262 jet fighter fuselages. The diversion south also worked and confused the Germans. However, it was of little use to the delayed Schweinfurt force, flying along a similar route as the Regensburg bombers. The German fighters had time to land, rearm, refuel, and attack the second penetration even harder than the first. After a grueling air battle, the bombers reached their target, but the bombing was less accurate. The combined raids were costly for the 8th. 60 B-17s were shot down, and 11 were scrapped on their return, with 600 casualties, around 16% of the force. Certain groups, such as the 100th and 95th Bomber Groups, lost almost 50%. The U.S. bomber air crews claimed to have shot down 288 enemy aircraft, but the real figure was closer to 47, with only 16 German pilots killed. The hugely exaggerated claims of shot-down enemy fighters were sometimes viewed skeptically by the commanders, but were accepted in the interest of morale. This was important as, statistically, the bomber crews faced some of the worst odds for all combatants. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to be robust and well defended by a 10-man crew in mutually supporting defensive air formations. But although the Luftwaffe pilots attacked from all directions, the U.S. air crews became especially concerned about attacks against the weaker front of the plane. Machine guns were later added to the plexiglass nose, but the B-17 gunners lacked training, and, despite the Allied claims, the German losses to the B-17 guns were low. One 8th Air Force commander was critical. I really felt that the gunners, in some cases, were more a hazard than they were a protection. I do not think we will ever know how many airplanes we shot down ourselves by this wild spraying of .50 caliber machine guns. The U.S. planners tried to improve the B-17, such as the G model with a remote-controlled chin turret, but the enemy fighters and flak were just two of the many dangers. Accidents were a problem, made worse by a lack of maintenance time, as were friendly fire, collisions in formation flying, frostbite, and poor weather. Many of the pilots lacked experience in taking off and landing in fog, especially with their overladen planes. An overloaded B-17 stalling out under 1,000 feet met its spectacular end in seconds. 3 tons of bombs, 2,700 gallons of high-octane fuel, about 6,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition, along with oxygen tanks, hydraulic and lubricating oil, all hitting the ground at over 200 miles an hour, left nothing but a steaming black smear. A whole crew bailing out was possible, but dangerous. The crew had to grab their parachutes in time, fight against the forces of a tumbling plane, and avoid other planes or debris in the sky. The pilots often remained on board to keep the plane flying level. The men also feared being shot while parachuting, and German civilians occasionally attacked downed bomber crews. Stoked by Nazi propaganda regarding the Anglo-American Luftgangsters, conservative estimates suggest that lynch mobs killed around 350 downed airmen, especially from 1944 onwards, although the actual figure may be higher. The German troops did generally take prisoners, though. Sergeant Ray Manley recalled his reception after bailing out. 4 German soldiers approached me and asked if I was armed. I said no, and then one of them replied in perfect English, "For you, the war is over." Then they walked me to a nearby village where a crowd of people had gathered. A little blonde girl, aged about 5 or 6, stood and looked me over. She smiled at me, the only friendly face there. Successive missions with high casualties also resulted in psychological breakdowns. The USAF reassigned the sufferers to non-combat roles, but the crews saw the psychological wounds with a social stigma attached to them. The men also knew that the bombing killed more German civilians than soldiers, which added additional stress for airmen like Colonel LeMay. You drop a load of bombs, and if you're cursed with any imagination at all, you have at least one quick horrid glimpse of a child lying in bed with a whole ton of masonry tumbling down on top of him. Then you have to turn away from the picture if you intend to retain your sanity. For the 8th Bomber Command crews, the stats were grim. A 1943 study found that only 26% completed their 25 missions. 57% were killed, missing, or captured, and 17% were wounded, killed in accidents, or discharged due to mental conditions. But the numbers paint an incomplete picture. The casualty rates among the bombers varied greatly between the different parts of the formation. Some might escape unscathed, while others might be almost wiped out. The 100th Bomber Group gained a gruesome reputation for high losses, earning it the nickname the Bloody Hundredth. At Regensburg, the 100th lost 9 of its 21 attacking bombers, the highest of any group. The 100th Bomber crewmen began to suspect that the Luftwaffe fighters were deliberately targeting them, perhaps as revenge. A story spread among the U.S. crewmen that on an earlier raid, a damaged B-17 from the 100th had dropped its landing gear to signal its surrender to a German fighter. When the fighter flew closer to escort it to the ground, the B-17 gunners had opened fire, shooting the fighter down. The story, though, is probably false. The reality was likely more mundane. At Regensburg, many of the 100th Group's bombers flew in the most vulnerable positions of the wing, the high and low squadrons of the low combat box in the formation. These exposed positions lacked the supporting fire of the central ones and were often targeted first, earning them the nickname Purple Heart Corner or Coffin Corner. But the rumor stuck, and in October a new raid seemed to confirm the Bloody Hundredth's curse. On October 10, 1943, the U.S. planners targeted the city of Munster. 274 B-17s would attack the city center in the first explicit U.S. raid to bomb civilian housing. The goal was to kill or render homeless the workers of Munster's factories and transport facilities, reducing both manpower and morale. The aiming point was the Munster Cathedral on a Sunday afternoon. The 100th was exhausted after another week of intense bombing, But the Americans expected the Münster raid to be relatively easy due to its proximity to the Dutch border and its fighter escort. However, it soon turned into a disaster. Fog prevented some of the escorts from joining the bombers, and up to 350 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled to intercept the raid, especially the 100th Bomb Group in Coffin Corner. Captain Frank Murphy, aboard a 100th Group B-17 nicknamed Argo, recalled, "The German aircraft came after the 100th in seemingly endless waves. As one element of fighters broke away, another was turning for a head-on attack far ahead of us. Fighter after fighter flew directly into our formation, passing so close that we could distinctly see the German pilots in their cockpits. More than once, I turned away from the attacking fighters, fully expecting a certain head-on collision." Within moments, the German Me-109s and FW-190s shot down 3 of the 100th's lead squadron. The damaged bombers, falling out of formation, found themselves especially vulnerable to the heavy twin-engine German aircraft like the Me-110, 410, and U-88. The bombers' gunners attempted to drive off the attacks, but their weapons jammed, crewmen were wounded, and ammunition ran out. The B-17's waist guns and turrets were often the most dangerous positions to man. Within the stricken B-17s, chaotic scenes played out. I heard loud yelling behind me. I turned and saw Sergeant Auger squatting beside the navigator, with blood streaming down his face. The navigator, obviously in a state of complete shock, was screaming at him, "Get back on your guns or I'll kill you." He started searching through his gear for his pistol. The U.S. lost 30 B-17s. Of the 100th Group's 13 bombers on the raid, 12 were shot down, with 32 killed and 88 captured. The lone surviving bomber, the Royal Flush, limped home on 2 engines, a non-functioning oxygen system, and with wounded crew. Its pilot, Robert Rosenthal, would go on to complete 52 missions, double the standard tour. Despite the losses, the lead bombers hit Münster, killing 700 civilians. For the bombers, the lesson of October's so-called Black Week was the need for better long-range fighter escort. New fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, and improved fuel-drop tanks were coming, but the Allied plans to cripple the German war industry meant that the bomber missions often outranged their fighter escort. 4 days after Münster, the 100th Bomb Group joined another ambitious mission deep into Germany. The target was once again Schweinfurt. The Bomber Command believed that a raid on the ball-bearing plant could set back German fighter production by months. It would be the biggest U.S. raid yet. 383 B-17s in 2 forces would penetrate into Germany without fighter escort. Within 100 kilometers of their route, around 1,100 Luftwaffe fighters were based. The U.S. veterans of the first Schweinfurt raid 2 months prior were concerned. When the briefing officer said, "Gentlemen, your target for today is Schweinfurt," everyone groaned. The ball-bearing plants would be heavily defended. We knew our third mission would be one hell of a fight. Again, the raid started poorly. Delays and weather confused the fighter escort rendezvous. By the time the escorting P-47s neared the Dutch border, some had only 15 minutes of fuel for combat. Mechanical problems meant that only 291 bombers continued on to the target. When the Allied fighter escort turned back around Aachen, the Luftwaffe attacked with everything they had, including a new weapon. I shouted that a Messerschmitt 110 behind us, out of range, was firing something at us, and it was leaving a black stream of smoke. We didn't know what it was at the time, but we discovered later that it was a rocket. The missile exploded right under our plane. It felt as if we were on an elevator. It lifted us up and did all kinds of damage. The American bombers arranged themselves into mutually supporting masses, up to 100 strong, but the Luftwaffe planes launched coordinated attacks. While twin-engine Zerstörer aircraft, like the Me-110, volleyed rockets into the B-17 formations to cause disruption, the single-engine fighters accelerated in front to open up with a grouped head-on attack. Once out of formation or damaged, the isolated bombers could be picked off from all directions. As the Americans approached Schweinfurt, the flak guns, some crewed by teenagers, took over the defense. Our fire control equipment registered the formation immediately. Every 3 seconds the alarm bell rang. That means volley fire from all guns. The enemy aircraft were densely surrounded by the airbursts of anti-aircraft shells. Large, dark, in some places blood-red clouds of smoke and dust hung over the city. Often only afterwards were we stricken with fear. We 16-year-olds had to overcome it each in his own way. 228 B-17s reached Schweinfurt to bomb it with generally good accuracy. The Luftwaffe pursued them on the return flight. Only when the bombers reached the safety of their escort fighters near the channel did the equally exhausted Germans retire. Some of the Luftwaffe pilots had flown 3 individual sorties during the raid. The U.S. losses were 60 B-17s shot down and 121 damaged, 17 beyond repair. 600 men were dead or missing. 13-year-old Ernst Reichert found a crashed bomber. With other boys, I ran straight to the suspected emergency landing site. On the left, in the burned-out cockpit, was the completely charred and shrunken pilot. His hands still gripped the steering wheel tightly. The flying fortress had already burned down and was still smoking. Behind the pilot was another crewman, also charred, tilted sideways. The bomber crews claimed they had shot down 186 Germans, but the actual figure was around 40. The Allied commanders claimed that the attack destroyed 3 ball-bearing factories and shut down the entire works. Privately, though, the 8th Bomber Command was concerned about the high losses. The second Schweinfurt raid ended the USAF's deep, unescorted penetrations, while poor weather stopped any major bombing until February 1944. When the commanders assessed the year's progress, they were still not sure how much damage they had done. Assessing the damage was difficult due to inaccuracies in the bomber surveys and debates about the German war economy. The post-war RAF and USAF surveys tended to exaggerate the impact, both economically and psychologically. In the USAF's case, this was partly to encourage its reform as a separate, independent branch of the military. But even some of the analysts at the time accepted that the results were disappointing. Firstly, the Allied intelligence had worked under the assumption that Germany had been fully mobilized from the start of the war, limiting the German war production growth. However, Germany consistently found surplus industrial capacity, although historians debate whether this was due to a lack of early war mobilization or to fixing economic inefficiencies. In any case, general arms production continued to increase until it peaked in 1944. Fighter and ball-bearing production was also not hugely disrupted by the bombing in 1943. Until the final months of the war, the Germans built more aircraft and fighters and compensated for the ball-bearing production damage with porcelain substitutes, rigid controls, imports from Sweden, and unused stockpiles. Some historians, such as Alan Levine, suggest that the bombing may have reduced German armaments growth by as little as 5%. Others argue that the 1943 combined bomber offensive should be viewed as a German defensive victory. Although no bomber force was totally destroyed or forced to turn back, the Allied bombers had failed to cripple German war production. The armaments minister, Albert Speer, later claimed that follow-up raids on the bombed facilities could have caused significant damage, but such raids often came too late, by which time the equipment had been salvaged and the buildings repaired. But this potential German defensive victory was highly conditional. The 1943 campaign did wear down the Luftwaffe. In all theaters, the Luftwaffe lost 30 to 40% of its entire force every month. For a while, new production replaced the aircraft losses, but the Luftwaffe lacked experienced pilots. The new pilots received less training, and advanced skills like instrument flying and night flying became rare. Although there were advances, like the jet fighters, the Luftwaffe also adopted more desperate measures, like mobilizing their own bombers in the fight against the Allied bombing. The Luftwaffe converted surplus bombers like the Dornier Dor 17 into heavy fighters and even theorized concepts of air-to-air bombing, dropping time-fused bombs onto the enemy formations. A huge amount of resources and manpower were also being locked down in the German air defense. By the end of 1943, 9,000 88mm guns, 25,000 other anti-aircraft weapons, and half the electronics industry were diverted to air defense. This meant fewer weapons on the front line and more equipment in passive roles. On average, 16,000 shells were fired per bomber shot down. The bombing in 1943 also set up the German war industry for future failures. The German authorities brought more forced laborers into war production, impacting both output and quality. Meanwhile, the factories that were dispersed or moved underground were less efficient. Dispersal may have reduced fighter production by 25% compared to the concentrated factories. Such isolated factories were also more vulnerable to transportation bombing, which would become a major Allied target in 1944. The Luftwaffe's successes in 1943 may also have had more to do with the Allied limitations than German strategy. The weather, inexperience, and a lack of fighter escorts arguably played a bigger role. By the end of 1943, the Allies were working on solutions to these problems, like better radar and radio equipment, longer-range fighters, and improved training. As soon as the weather cleared in February 1944, the bombing offensive would continue on an even bigger scale. The bombing campaign of 1943 killed tens of thousands of German civilians and turned the heart of the Reich into a major front. Meanwhile, far from the front lines and the momentous battles, the Nazi regime's plan to murder Europe's Jews, Roma, and other groups in the Holocaust continued. Berlin also targeted the remaining German Jews, including the arrest of thousands who were married to Christian German women. This led to a rare example of open German opposition to the government's policy in February 1943. Hundreds of wives and relatives gathered in Berlin's Rosenstrasse to demand the release of their loved ones being held there by the Gestapo. The police released some, but sent others to their death in the concentration camps. This protest, though, was a small exception in the midst of the ongoing genocide. Aktion Reinhardt was the name the Germans gave to their operation to kill the more than 2 million Jews living in the ghettos in Eastern Europe. In 1942, the SS experimented with methods for mass killings and settled on gas chambers, which they built at 3 main killing centers, or death camps: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The plan was to deport most of the Jews from the larger ghettos: Warsaw, Lodz, Bialystok, Vilnius, Minsk, Riga, and Kaunas, along with thousands of Roma people. Once the deportees arrived, the German guards tricked them into thinking they were being sent to Schorrs, but instead they were gassed. Jewish worker Shimon Goldberg described the gassing of the Roma at Treblinka. "While I was there, they killed about 2,000 gypsies. The gypsies went wild, screamed awfully, and wanted to break down the chambers. They climbed up the walls toward the apertures at the top, and even tried to break the barred window. The Germans climbed onto the roof, fired inside, sealed off the apertures, and asphyxiated everyone." In this way, by September 1943, the Germans had killed 250,000 Jews at Sobibor, 600,000 at Belzhytz, and 874,000 and several thousand Roma at Treblinka. Most of the Polish, Baltic, and Belarusian Jewish population was now dead. But the killing in 1943 did not stop with Operation Reinhardt. In November, the Germans killed more than 40,000 at the Majdanek, Trauniki, and Poniatowa camps in what they called Operation Harvest Festival. And in other parts of Europe, the German and collaborationist authorities continued deporting and murdering other Jewish communities. Starting in February, the SS officials deported nearly all of the historic 50,000-strong Jewish community in Salonika to Auschwitz, where the camp authorities immediately gassed 2/3 of them. In Bulgarian-controlled Macedonia and Thrace, the Bulgarian authorities deported 11,000 Jews, whom the Germans then killed. Sofia then went back on its agreement with Germany and refused to deport the Jewish population living inside the pre-war Bulgarian borders. After Italy surrendered in September, the German troops occupied the country, and the Nazi government tried to kill the Italian Jews, whom up until then the Mussolini regime had refused to deport. In October, the SS and the Italian police began to round up the Italian Jewish population for transport and murder in Auschwitz. In the end, they killed about 15% of the Italian Jews. In occupied Denmark, Germany declared martial law after a series of strikes and planned to deport and kill the 7,500 Jews in the country. The Danish government contacted the Swedes, who agreed to accept the Jewish refugees escaping by boat, the majority of whom did. Most of the Jewish victims of Aktion Reinhardt and the other mass murders had no chance to defend themselves. But in 1943, thousands of Jews rose in revolt against the Nazis. In August, at the Treblinka killing center, the Jewish prisoners fought back against the SS guards, and 200 escaped, most of whom the Germans caught and killed. In October, at Sobibor, Jewish Red Army prisoners of war led an uprising that killed 13 SS men and other guards, including the center's deputy commander. 300 prisoners escaped, of whom 50 survived the war in hiding. 2 of these were Chaim Engel and Selma Weinberg, who later married. Selma, suffering from typhus, later recalled the terrifying escape from the camp as the guards machine-gunned the crowd. Chaim took my hand and he said, "Come, it's no use we stay there." And then everybody starts running to this gate. Everybody was falling around next to us. You hear mines going and people dropping dead. You just run. I was very nervous, of course, when you had to run. I get diarrhea and I had to stop all the time. We heard shooting behind us and we heard screaming and we were running and running. And so the so-called forgotten year of 1943 saw the Allies push the Germans out of North Africa, Sicily, part of Italy, and the Atlantic, and smash the Wehrmacht backwards from the Volga in Russia to the Dnipro in Ukraine. But even though the Germans were losing, they were making the Allies pay dearly and were clinging to their conquests. The Allied campaign in Italy was bogged down. The bombing campaign suffered heavy losses in men and planes, and the Red Army lost hundreds of thousands of men without achieving its ambitious strategic goals. The Germans were losing the war, and the odds were stacked against them, but they had stabilized the lines in the east and in Italy for now. As the historian Robert Citino writes, But is it possible that there were some in the German military, not just Hitler, but men among the staff and field commanders, who looked around at the end of this horrible year, took a deep breath, and began to hope that, with a tweak here and there, a little more willpower, and perhaps a bit of luck, they might actually survive their ordeal? These thoughts were a departure from the rational approach to war the German officer corps had long prided itself upon. Germany was out of options for holding on to its supposed thousand-year Reich, and yet it still underestimated the willpower of its more powerful enemies. The Allies had definitively gained the upper hand, and 1944 would make that abundantly clear.